Deep beneath the earth, archaeologists have uncovered something that challenges everything we think we know about ancient civilization. Human skulls, dating back over 5,000 years, bear witness to a procedure so precise, so deliberate, that it defies our assumptions about primitive humanity. These skulls contain perfectly circular holes, drilled with stone tools by hands that understood something profound about the human mind. What you're looking at isn't evidence of violence or accident. These holes were created to heal, to release something invisible, something that tormented the mind and soul. Our ancestors, it seems, were performing brain surgery before they had written language, before they built cities, before they understood the circulation of blood. This discovery forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps we've underestimated the sophistication of ancient minds. Perhaps their understanding of mental illness, while different from ours, contained wisdom we've forgotten in our rush toward modernity. Before we delve deeper into this extraordinary journey through time, I'm curious to know where you're listening from today. Are you at home, perhaps sipping a warm drink, or are you on your daily commute? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you find these ancient mysteries as compelling as I do, consider subscribing. We have many more forgotten stories waiting to be told. What we'll explore today will take us from prehistoric caves to the marble temples of ancient Greece. We'll discover how the treatment of mental illness evolved from crude but effective surgery to sophisticated healing sanctuaries that combined medicine, psychology, and spirituality in ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate again. The story begins not with civilization, but with desperation. In the darkness of prehistory, when humans lived in small tribes and survival depended on understanding the natural world, mental illness presented a terrifying puzzle. When a member of the community began acting strangely, hearing voices that others couldn't hear, or falling into deep despairs that lasted for seasons, the tribe faced a crisis that threatened their very survival. Archaeological evidence paints a picture both brutal and surprisingly sophisticated. Skulls discovered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas show evidence of trephination, the practice of boring holes into the living skull. These weren't random acts of violence. The holes were carefully placed, skillfully executed, and remarkably, many patients survived the procedure. How do we know they survived? The evidence is written in bone. Around the edges of these ancient holes, we can see signs of healing, new bone growth that could only occur if the person lived for months or even years after the surgery. Some skulls show evidence of multiple procedures, suggesting that patients returned for additional treatments throughout their lives. The survival rates were astonishing. Modern analysis suggests that between 50 and 90% of these prehistoric brain surgeries resulted in successful healing. To put this in perspective, brain surgery in the 19th century, performed by trained physicians with metal instruments in sterile environments, had far lower survival rates due to infection and complications. But why were our ancestors drilling holes in heads? The most compelling theory centers on the belief in demonic possession. Early humans, lacking our modern understanding of neurology and psychology, interpreted mental illness as the intrusion of evil spirits into the body. These malevolent entities, they believed, entered through the top of the head and became trapped inside the skull. The solution seemed logical within their worldview. Create an escape route by carefully drilling a hole in the skull. Shamans and early healers provided a pathway for these troublesome spirits to flee, hopefully taking the madness with them. The bone fragments removed during these procedures were often kept as protective amulets, perhaps to prevent the spirits from returning. Yet, as we examine these ancient practices more closely, a different picture emerges. Some researchers now believe that trephination may have had genuine medical benefits that our ancestors observed but couldn't fully understand. By relieving pressure on the brain, the procedure could have helped patients suffering from head injuries, blood clots, or certain types of seizures. The tools used were remarkably sophisticated. Prehistoric surgeons employed flint blades, obsidian scrapers, and specially designed boring implements. They understood the importance of precision, avoiding the brain's vital areas, while creating openings just large enough to serve their purpose. Some evidence suggests they even used primitive forms of anesthesia, including fermented beverages and plant-based painkillers. As civilizations developed and human understanding grew more complex, the purely supernatural explanations for mental illness began to evolve. But rather than abandoning their spiritual approach entirely, our ancestors integrated new ideas with old wisdom, creating increasingly sophisticated systems of healing that addressed both body and soul. This evolution would reach its pinnacle in ancient Greece, where the treatment of mental illness would undergo a transformation that laid the foundation for modern psychiatry. When Greek civilization emerged from the Bronze Age collapse around 1200, it inherited a complex web of beliefs about mental illness from earlier cultures. But the Greeks, with their unique genius for systematic thinking and their pantheon of anthropomorphic gods, transformed these ancient practices into something unprecedented: sacred psychiatry. The transition wasn't immediate or uniform. In the earliest Greek texts, mental illness still carried the stamp of divine intervention. Homer's epics are filled with characters whose minds are clouded by gods, whose rational thoughts are overwhelmed by divine madness. When Achilles rages uncontrollably, when heroes make decisions that seem to defy logic, the explanation is always the same: a god has intervened in human consciousness. But the Greeks developed this concept far beyond simple possession. They created a sophisticated theology of mental states that recognized different types of divine madness, each with its own purpose and treatment. Prophetic madness, sent by Apollo, allowed humans to see the future. Ritual madness, inspired by Dionysus, provided spiritual purification through ecstatic experience. Love madness, gifted by Aphrodite, drove the great romantic passions that shaped human destiny. This wasn't merely primitive superstition. The Greeks understood that mental states could be altered deliberately, that certain practices could induce specific types of consciousness, and that these altered states could serve therapeutic purposes. Modern psychology would later rediscover these insights in its study of altered states of consciousness, therapeutic trance, and the healing power of cathartic emotional release. The most remarkable development in Greek psychiatric practice was the emergence of the Asclepians, healing temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. These weren't crude shrines where desperate people came to beg for miraculous cures. They were sophisticated medical complexes that combined spiritual practice with what we would now recognize as advanced psychotherapy. More than 300 Asclepians operated throughout the ancient world, but their placement wasn't random. These healing centers were always constructed in locations chosen for their therapeutic properties: sheltered valleys with mild climates, natural springs with mineral properties, forests that provided both privacy and a sense of sacred space. Modern analysis has confirmed that many of these locations possess unique geological features, including elevated levels of natural radioactivity that might have had genuine healing effects. The architecture of the Asclepians reveals their sophisticated approach to mental health treatment. Each complex included multiple buildings designed for different aspects of the healing process. There were libraries where patients could study philosophical texts, theaters where they could experience cathartic drama, gymnasiums for physical exercise, and elaborate bathhouses for hydrotherapy. At the heart of each Asclepian stood the abaton, the sacred dormitory where the crucial healing ritual took place. This was where patients underwent enkoimesis, the practice of sacred sleep that formed the centerpiece of Greek psychiatric treatment. The process began with extensive purification rituals. Patients fasted for days, bathed in sacred springs, and participated in ceremonies designed to cleanse both body and spirit. They were given special diets and herbal preparations that modern analysis suggests included mild psychoactive compounds derived from plants like hellebore and mandrake. Once properly prepared, patients were led into the abaton as the sun set. These circular or labyrinthian chambers were designed to disorient and calm the mind simultaneously. Patients lay on marble floors near statues of Asclepius, surrounded by the gentle sounds of water flowing through underground channels. In this sacred space, they waited for the god to visit them in dreams. These weren't merely random nightmares or wishful fantasies. The priest-physicians of the Asclepians were skilled dream interpreters who had developed sophisticated methods for understanding the symbolic language of the unconscious mind. They recognized that dreams could reveal hidden psychological conflicts, repressed memories, and pathways toward healing. The animals sacred to Asclepius played crucial roles in these healing rituals. Non-venomous serpents moved freely through the abaton, their presence believed to channel the god's healing power. Dogs, also sacred to the healing deity, provided comfort and companionship to distressed patients. Modern animal-assisted therapy has rediscovered the profound psychological benefits of human-animal interaction that the Greeks understood intuitively. But the Asclepians offered more than symbolic healing. The priest-physicians were skilled in practical medicine as well as spiritual practice. They performed surgeries, prescribed medications, and developed treatment protocols that combined physical intervention with psychological support. They understood that healing the mind required addressing the whole person: body, emotions, social relationships, and spiritual beliefs. The inscriptions found at Asclepian sites describe successful treatments for a wide range of conditions that we would now classify as mental illnesses. Depression, anxiety, what appears to be post-traumatic stress from warfare, and various forms of psychotic episodes were all addressed through the combination of spiritual ritual, pharmaceutical intervention, and psychological counseling. Yet, this wasn't the only approach to mental illness developing in Greek society. While the Asclepians flourished as centers of sacred healing, a parallel revolution was taking place in Greek medical thought. This transformation would challenge the supremacy of divine explanation and introduce concepts that remain central to psychiatric practice today. The catalyst for this revolution was a physician whose name has become synonymous with medical ethics: Hippocrates of Kos, born around 460 on the small Aegean island that would later house one of the most famous Asclepians. Hippocrates grew up surrounded by the traditional sacred approach to healing. Yet, he would become the architect of a radically different understanding of mental illness. Hippocrates made a declaration that would echo through the centuries. Men ought to know that from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter, and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. And by this, in an especial manner, we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear and know what are foul and what are fair, what are bad and what are good, what are sweet and what are unsavory. This wasn't merely an academic observation. It was a revolutionary assertion that mental states arose from physical processes within the brain, not from the arbitrary interventions of gods or the invasion of evil spirits. In making this claim, Hippocrates laid the foundation for biological psychiatry more than 2 millennia before the discovery of neurotransmitters. But Hippocrates didn't simply reject spiritual explanations for mental illness. Instead, he developed a comprehensive theory that attempted to explain how physical processes in the body could produce the wide range of mental states that physicians observed in their patients. This theory centered on the concept of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to Hippocratic theory, mental health depended on the proper balance of these bodily fluids. Each humor was associated with specific qualities and mental states. Blood, warm and moist, produced optimism and cheerfulness when balanced, but could cause manic excitement when excessive. Phlegm, cold and moist, was linked to calmness and stability, but also to lethargy and emotional numbness when predominant. Yellow bile, hot and dry, generated courage and ambition in proper proportions, but could lead to rage and violent behavior when uncontrolled. Black bile, cold and dry, was perhaps the most significant humor for psychiatric theory. In balance, it promoted deep thinking and artistic creativity. In excess, it caused melancholia, the condition we now call depression. Modern medicine has moved far beyond humoral theory, but Hippocrates' fundamental insight remains valid. Mental illness often has biological origins that can be treated through physical interventions. His emphasis on the brain as the seat of consciousness anticipated discoveries that wouldn't be confirmed until the development of modern neuroscience. Hippocrates classified mental disorders into 3 primary categories, each requiring different treatment approaches. Mania, characterized by elevated mood, increased energy, and impaired judgment, was understood as an excess of warm, dry humors that needed to be cooled and moistened. Melancholia, marked by persistent sadness, loss of energy, and withdrawal from social interaction, resulted from too much cold, dry black bile that required warming and moistening treatments. The third category, phrenitis, described what we might now call acute psychotic episodes, conditions involving fever, delirium, hallucinations, and severe confusion. Hippocrates correctly identified these as brain inflammations that required immediate medical intervention to prevent permanent damage or death. The treatments prescribed by Hippocratic physicians were surprisingly sophisticated and often effective. For mania, they recommended cooling baths, sedating herbal preparations, dietary restrictions that eliminated heating foods, and physical restraint when necessary to prevent patients from harming themselves or others. Modern mood stabilizers work through different mechanisms, but they achieve similar goals of reducing excessive mental excitement. For melancholia, Hippocratic medicine prescribed warming treatments, hot baths, stimulating herbs, exercises designed to increase circulation, and dietary modifications that included warming spices and fortifying foods. Social interaction was also emphasized, as physicians recognized that isolation often worsened depressive conditions. Perhaps most importantly, Hippocratic medicine established the principle that mental illness should be treated with the same scientific rigor as physical disease. This meant careful observation of symptoms, systematic record-keeping, and the development of treatment protocols based on empirical evidence, rather than spiritual revelation or cultural tradition. The Hippocratic physicians were keen observers of human behavior. Their case studies, recorded in works like the Epidemics, provide detailed descriptions of mental illness that remain clinically accurate today. They noted the seasonal patterns of depression, the cyclical nature of manic episodes, and the relationship between physical health and mental well-being. They also recognized the importance of early intervention, rather than waiting for mental illness to reach crisis levels. Hippocratic medicine emphasized prevention through lifestyle modifications, stress reduction, and the maintenance of physical health. This holistic approach acknowledged that mental and physical well-being were inseparably connected. Yet even as rational medicine gained influence, it never completely displaced the spiritual traditions that had dominated earlier healing practices. Many Hippocratic physicians continued to work within or alongside the Asclepian system, recognizing that different patients might benefit from different approaches to healing. This pragmatic flexibility would prove crucial as Greek medicine evolved to incorporate increasingly sophisticated pharmaceutical interventions. As Greek medical knowledge expanded, physicians began experimenting with substances that could directly alter mental states. These early psychiatric medications were derived from plants that grew wild throughout the Mediterranean world, and their effects ranged from gently calming to potentially deadly. The line between medicine and poison was often razor-thin. The most famous of these ancient psychiatric drugs was hellebore, a plant so central to Greek mental health treatment that it became synonymous with madness cure itself. The phrase, sailing to Antisera, the location of the finest hellebore, became a common expression meaning seeking treatment for insanity. But hellebore came in two varieties, and the difference between them could mean life or death. Black hellebore, harvested from the toxic Christmas rose, was prescribed for mania and violent madness. Its active compounds could indeed calm agitated patients, but the margin between therapeutic and lethal doses was perilously small. Ancient physicians knew that hellebore treatment required careful preparation and constant monitoring. Patients had to fast before treatment, undergo purification rituals, and be watched closely for signs of poisoning. The symptoms of hellebore overdose were well documented in ancient medical texts: violent purging from both ends of the digestive system, cardiac irregularities, seizures, and often death. Yet, when administered correctly, black hellebore could break the cycle of manic episodes and return patients to rational thought. Modern analysis has confirmed that hellebore contains cardiac glycosides similar to those found in digitalis, compounds that can indeed affect brain function through their impact on circulation and metabolism. White hellebore, derived from a different plant entirely, was used for different types of mental disturbance. This substance induced violent sneezing and nasal discharge, which physicians believed could clear accumulated phlegm from the head and restore mental clarity. While this theory was incorrect, white hellebore's active compounds do have legitimate pharmacological effects that might have provided some therapeutic benefit. Even more controversial was the use of mandrake, a plant surrounded by supernatural beliefs and elaborate harvesting rituals. Ancient texts claimed that mandrake grew only in the shadow of gallows, nourished by the tears of condemned criminals. Its root, which often resembled a human figure, was said to emit a deadly scream when pulled from the earth, a sound that could drive listeners insane or kill them outright. To avoid this supernatural danger, ancient harvests required elaborate precautions. The mandrake had to be located during specific astrological conditions, usually the dark of the moon. A black dog was tied to the plant and then called away, pulling the root from the soil while the harvester covered his ears and retreated to a safe distance. Only after the plant was safely uprooted could it be processed into medicine. These seemingly superstitious rituals may have served practical purposes. Mandrake contains potent alkaloids, including scopolamine and atropine, compounds that can cause hallucinations, delirium, and respiratory depression. The elaborate harvesting precautions might have been designed to limit exposure to these dangerous substances during collection. When properly prepared and administered, mandrake served as a powerful anesthetic and sedative. Ancient surgeons used it to render patients unconscious during operations, and psychiatrists prescribed it for severe agitation and insomnia. But the line between therapeutic sedation and toxic overdose was extremely narrow, and many patients died from mandrake poisoning. The opium poppy provided another crucial medication for ancient psychiatric practice. Greek physicians understood that opium could relieve both physical and emotional pain, and they developed sophisticated preparations that balanced therapeutic benefit against the risk of dependence. They recognized that regular opium use could lead to tolerance and withdrawal symptoms, observations that wouldn't be systematically studied by modern medicine until the 19th century. Ancient psychiatric pharmacy extended far beyond these famous examples. Physicians experimented with cannabis for its calming effects, used frankincense smoke to induce meditative states, and prescribed various combinations of herbs, wines, and minerals to address different mental conditions. They developed techniques for extracting active compounds, methods for preserving medications, and protocols for monitoring patient responses to treatment. But pharmaceutical intervention was only part of ancient psychiatric practice. Greek physicians also recognized the power of psychological manipulation and environmental control in treating mental illness. They used music therapy, prescribing specific melodies and rhythms for different conditions. Phrygian music, with its complex harmonies and rapid tempo, was believed to stimulate melancholic patients and lift them from depression. Dorian music, stately and measured, was used to calm manic episodes and restore emotional balance. Color therapy was another sophisticated aspect of ancient psychiatric treatment. Patients were surrounded by specific colors believed to influence their mental states. Red and orange were thought to stimulate energy and combat depression, while blue and green were used to calm anxiety and reduce agitation. Modern studies of color psychology have confirmed that environmental colors can indeed affect mood and behavior, though not always in the ways ancient physicians believed. The most controversial aspect of ancient psychiatric treatment involved ritual purification and symbolic cleansing. Patients underwent elaborate ceremonies designed to remove spiritual pollution that was believed to contribute to mental illness. These rituals often included confession of sins, symbolic death and rebirth experiences, and community ceremonies that reintegrated recovered patients into normal social life. While modern medicine has largely abandoned the spiritual framework that underlay these practices, contemporary psychiatry has rediscovered the therapeutic value of ritual, symbolism, and community support in mental health treatment. Cognitive behavioral therapy incorporates elements that ancient physicians would have recognized, including the systematic challenging of irrational thoughts and the use of symbolic exercises to promote psychological healing. Perhaps most remarkably, ancient Greek physicians developed something resembling modern psychoanalytic techniques. They understood that mental illness often stemmed from repressed memories, unresolved conflicts, and unconscious fears. The dream interpretation practices at the Asclepians provided structured methods for bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness, allowing patients to confront and resolve psychological conflicts that were contributing to their symptoms. These ancient insights would be lost and rediscovered multiple times throughout medical history. But their fundamental wisdom remains relevant to contemporary psychiatric practice. Ancient literature and medical texts preserve several detailed accounts of mental illness that provide us with vivid portraits of how these conditions affected real people and how physicians and society responded to psychological disturbance. These cases offer insights not only into ancient psychiatric practice, but also into the human experience of mental illness across the centuries. Perhaps the most famous case in ancient literature is that of Ajax, the great warrior of the Trojan War, whose story was immortalized by Sophocles in one of his most powerful tragedies. Ajax's mental breakdown provides what may be the earliest detailed clinical description of what we would now recognize as bipolar disorder or major depressive episode with psychotic features. The trigger for Ajax's illness was a devastating blow to his self-esteem and social identity. After Achilles' death, his divine armor was awarded to Odysseus rather than to Ajax, who had expected to receive this honor as recognition of his prowess in battle. This public humiliation shattered Ajax's sense of worth and purpose, precipitating a psychological crisis that escalated rapidly into dangerous psychosis. Under the influence of what the Greeks called divine madness sent by the goddess Athena, Ajax experienced vivid hallucinations and delusions. He believed he was attacking the Greek commanders who had denied him recognition, but in reality, he was slaughtering cattle and sheep. In his psychotic state, he bound animals and tortured them with whips, pouring forth what Sophocles described as awful curses against his imagined enemies. When Ajax emerged from his psychotic episode and realized what he had actually done, he was overwhelmed by shame and despair. The man who had been one of Greece's greatest heroes could not bear the humiliation of his public breakdown and the ridicule he expected from his peers. In a final act of desperate pride, he fell upon his sword, choosing death over dishonor. Sophocles' portrayal of Ajax's mental illness demonstrates sophisticated understanding of several concepts that remain central to modern psychiatry. The play shows how psychological trauma can trigger acute psychiatric episodes, how psychosis can involve both hallucinations and delusions, and how shame and social stigma can prevent recovery and even lead to self-destruction. The character of Ajax also illustrates the ancient Greek understanding of the relationship between mental illness and social identity. Warriors like Ajax derived their sense of self-worth entirely from their reputation for courage and strength. When that identity was threatened, the psychological foundation of their existence crumbled, making them vulnerable to complete mental collapse. Another fascinating case from ancient sources involves Cleomenes I, a Spartan king whose reign ended in madness and mysterious death around 490. Unlike Ajax, whose breakdown was fictional, Cleomenes was a real historical figure whose mental illness was documented by multiple ancient historians. Herodotus, our primary source for Cleomenes' story, describes a man who showed signs of mental instability throughout his life, but whose condition deteriorated dramatically in his final years. After being recalled to Sparta on suspicion of treasonous activities, Cleomenes began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed even his fellow Spartans, a people not easily disturbed by violence or eccentricity. The king's symptoms included paranoid delusions. He was seized by fear of his people and fled Sparta to seek military support from neighboring tribes. When he was captured and brought back to face judgment, his behavior became so disorganized and threatening that the authorities had him placed in stocks under constant guard. What happened next provides a chilling glimpse into the reality of untreated, severe mental illness in ancient times. Alone in his restraints, Cleomenes obtained a knife from one of his guards through unknown means, in a final act of self-destruction that horrified even the violence-hardened Spartans. He methodically sliced his own flesh into strips, dying from his self-inflicted wounds. Ancient sources offered various explanations for Cleomenes' madness, most of them connecting his mental illness to divine punishment for acts of sacrilege. He had invaded sacred sites, shown disrespect for religious rituals, and most seriously, corrupted the oracle at Delphi to provide false prophecies that served his political purposes. Modern historians and psychiatrists who have studied the ancient accounts suggest that Cleomenes may have suffered from what we would now diagnose as paranoid schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features. His fear of persecution, erratic behavior, and ultimate self-destruction follow patterns that are recognizable in contemporary psychiatric practice. The case of Cleomenes also illustrates the social and political dimensions of mental illness in ancient society. As a king, his psychological breakdown had consequences far beyond personal suffering. It destabilized the Spartan state, influenced military campaigns, and affected diplomatic relationships throughout the Greek world. Ancient drama provides another rich source of psychiatric case studies, particularly in the works of Euripides, who showed remarkable insight into the psychological complexities of mental illness. His play, The Madness of Heracles, presents a detailed portrait of post-traumatic stress disorder, showing how a great hero can be destroyed not by external enemies, but by the internal wounds inflicted by violence and loss. In Euripides' version, Heracles returns from his famous labors to find that a usurper has murdered his family. The combination of grief, rage, and guilt triggers a psychotic episode in which Heracles, in his madness, kills his own children, believing them to be the children of his enemies. When he recovers his sanity and realizes what he has done, he must confront not only his grief, but also his guilt and the knowledge that his own mind has betrayed him. This portrayal demonstrates ancient understanding of several important psychiatric concepts. The way that traumatic stress can accumulate over time, how guilt and grief can interact to produce psychological breakdown, and how recovered patients must learn to live with the knowledge of actions they performed while mentally ill. The ancient world also preserved accounts of what we might now recognize as mood disorders and anxiety conditions. The Hippocratic case studies describe patients suffering from what appear to be major depression, panic disorder, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. These clinical descriptions are remarkable for their accuracy and detail, providing evidence that ancient physicians were careful observers of human psychology. One particularly poignant case from the Hippocratic corpus describes a young man named Parmeniscus, whose depression became so severe that he became mute and bedridden. For 14 days, he lay without speaking, eating little, and showing no interest in his surroundings. The physician's notes track his gradual recovery, though the specific treatments that led to his cure are not detailed in the surviving text. These ancient case studies reveal both the timeless nature of human mental suffering and the evolving understanding of how to respond to psychological distress. While the explanations and treatments have changed dramatically over the centuries, the fundamental human experience of mental illness remains recognizably similar across time and culture. The courage of ancient physicians to document these cases, despite the stigma and superstition surrounding mental illness, laid the foundation for the scientific study of psychiatry that continues today. As Greek medical knowledge advanced, physicians became increasingly bold in their experimentation with mind-altering substances and extreme treatments. Some of these interventions were remarkably sophisticated and occasionally effective. Others were so dangerous that they killed more patients than they helped. The line between cutting-edge therapy and lethal misadventure was often disturbingly thin. Among the most perilous treatments was the use of strychnine, a plant whose modern name reveals its deadly nature. Strychnine. Ancient physicians prescribed small doses of strychnine seeds for patients suffering from severe depression and catatonic states. The plant's powerful stimulant effects could indeed rouse patients from stuporous conditions. But the margin between therapeutic and toxic doses was virtually non-existent. Patients who received strychnine treatment experienced intense muscular contractions, heightened sensory awareness, and powerful emotional arousal. In carefully controlled doses, this could break through the mental paralysis of severe depression. But even slight overdoses caused violent convulsions, respiratory failure, and agonizing death. Ancient medical texts describe physicians watching anxiously for the first signs of muscle twitching that indicated the difference between successful treatment and fatal poisoning. The geographic distribution of strychnine treatment reveals something important about ancient medical networks. The plant grew primarily in India and Southeast Asia, meaning that Greek physicians had to import it along complex trade routes that crossed multiple continents. The exotic nature of this medicine, combined with its dramatic effects and obvious dangers, gave it an almost supernatural reputation among both physicians and patients. Even more controversial was the practice of deliberate fever induction for psychiatric patients. Ancient physicians observed that some mentally ill individuals showed temporary improvement during episodes of high fever caused by infectious diseases. This led to the development of therapeutic fever protocols that involved exposing patients to malaria-infected mosquitoes or administering substances that could trigger controlled inflammatory responses. The theoretical basis for fever therapy wasn't entirely irrational. Ancient physicians believed that mental illness sometimes resulted from cold humoral imbalances that could be corrected by introducing heat into the system. Modern medicine has discovered that fever can indeed affect brain chemistry and immune function in ways that might, theoretically, influence certain psychiatric conditions. But the practical implementation of fever therapy was extraordinarily dangerous. Many patients died from the infections deliberately introduced to cure their mental illness. Others survived the fever but emerged with permanent physical damage from the inflammatory process. The few who showed psychiatric improvement may have benefited more from the intensive medical attention they received during treatment than from the fever itself. Ancient physicians also experimented with what we would now recognize as shock therapy techniques. They used sudden exposure to extreme cold, including plunging agitated patients into ice-cold mountain streams or burying them temporarily in snow. The physiological shock of hypothermia could indeed interrupt manic episodes and severe agitation, but it also frequently caused death from cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. Sound-based treatments pushed the boundaries of ancient acoustic knowledge. Physicians developed elaborate protocols using specific combinations of musical instruments, vocal techniques, and environmental sounds to treat different psychiatric conditions. Some of these treatments involved sound levels that we would now recognize as potentially damaging to hearing, and some included infrasonic frequencies that could cause nausea, disorientation, and panic. The most sophisticated sound treatments were administered in specially constructed chambers within the Asclepions. These rooms were designed with complex acoustic properties that could amplify, focus, or modulate sound waves in ways that affected patients' mental states. Archaeological analysis of surviving structures suggests that some of these chambers may have been capable of producing standing wave patterns that could induce trance-like states similar to those achieved by modern sensory deprivation techniques. Chemical restraint protocols represented another dangerous frontier in ancient psychiatric treatment. Physicians developed preparations that could render violent patients unconscious for days or weeks at a time. These medications combined opium with various plant alkaloids to create powerful sedative cocktails that suppressed consciousness while keeping patients technically alive. The danger of these treatments wasn't limited to overdose risk. Prolonged unconsciousness led to muscle atrophy, respiratory complications, and increased susceptibility to infections. Many patients who survived the chemical restraint process emerged physically weakened and sometimes cognitively impaired. Yet, for severely psychotic individuals who posed dangers to themselves and others, these extreme measures were sometimes the only alternative to physical chains or execution. Perhaps the most ethically troubling aspect of ancient psychiatric treatment was the practice of using mentally ill patients for medical experimentation. Physicians recognized that psychological disturbance could provide unique opportunities to observe brain function and test new treatments. Patients who were considered mad had limited legal rights and social standing, making them vulnerable to procedures that would have been unthinkable to perform on mentally competent individuals. Some of these experiments involved surgical interventions that went far beyond therapeutic trephination. Ancient physicians performed exploratory operations on living brains, removed sections of skull to observe neural tissue, and tested the effects of various substances by applying them directly to exposed brain matter. While these procedures occasionally yielded valuable medical knowledge, they were performed without anything resembling modern concepts of informed consent or ethical oversight. The social isolation of mental patients also enabled physicians to test extreme dietary interventions that could have serious health consequences. Some treatments involved prolonged fasting periods that pushed patients to the edge of starvation. Others required consumption of potentially toxic substances in quantities that would have been dangerous for healthy individuals. Documentation from ancient medical schools reveals that psychiatric patients were sometimes used to train new physicians in procedures that were too risky to practice on other patients. Student doctors learned surgical techniques by operating on individuals whose mental illness was considered to make their lives less valuable than those of rational citizens. Yet alongside these disturbing practices, ancient physicians also developed treatments that demonstrated remarkable sophistication and genuine therapeutic insight. They recognized the importance of environmental factors in mental health and created healing spaces that incorporated principles we would now recognize as evidence-based environmental psychology. The integration of physical exercise, nutritional therapy, social interaction, and creative expression in ancient psychiatric treatment anticipated many elements of modern holistic mental health care. While their theoretical framework was often incorrect, their practical approach to treating the whole person rather than just symptoms showed wisdom that modern medicine is still working to fully implement. As Greek civilization matured, a fascinating tension developed between the spiritual traditions of the Asclepians and the rational approach of Hippocratic medicine. Rather than simply replacing old beliefs with new knowledge, Greek society developed a remarkably sophisticated understanding that different types of mental illness might require different approaches to healing. This integration of sacred and scientific approaches reflected a profound insight. Human psychology operates on multiple levels simultaneously: physical brain function, emotional experience, social relationships. The most advanced Greek physicians worked within both traditions, adapting their approach to individual patients' needs and beliefs. A rational skeptic who rejected divine explanations might respond better to Hippocratic medicine with its emphasis on physical causes and logical treatments. A deeply religious person might find greater healing in the ritual purification and dream interpretation offered by the This medical pluralism allowed ancient Greek society to address mental illness with unprecedented sophistication: psychological counseling for their emotional conflicts, social support for their relationship problems, and spiritual guidance for their existential concerns. Archaeological evidence reveals that many Asclepians incorporated Hippocratic medical practices alongside their traditional spiritual healing methods. This suggests that priest-physicians were trained in both divine healing traditions and rational medical techniques. The dream interpretation practices at the Asclepians evolved to incorporate psychological insights that anticipate modern psychoanalytic techniques, rather than simply revealing divine messages. Dreams were understood as expressing unconscious mental contents that needed to be brought into conscious awareness for healing to occur. Ancient dream interpretation manuals, some of which survive in fragmentary form, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of symbolic thinking, repressed memories, and the relationship between conscious and unconscious mental processes. These techniques were developed and refined over centuries of clinical practice with thousands of patients. The priest-physicians who administered these treatments underwent extensive training that combined medical education with spiritual development. This comprehensive education produced healers who could address the full spectrum of human suffering. But the integration of sacred and scientific approaches wasn't without its tensions and conflicts. Rational physicians sometimes criticized the Asclepians for encouraging superstition and delaying proper medical treatment. Temple priests, in turn, argued that purely rational medicine ignored the spiritual dimensions of illness and healing. These debates weren't merely academic. They had real consequences for patients whose lives depended on receiving effective treatment. Some individuals suffered or died because they received inappropriate care from practitioners who were too rigidly committed to either spiritual or rational approaches. The most successful ancient physicians learned to navigate these competing paradigms with remarkable skill, and they adapted their treatments accordingly. A patient who firmly believed in divine causation for their illness might indeed respond better to ritual purification than to herbal medicine, not because the gods were actually involved, but because the patient's expectations and cultural framework made spiritual healing more psychologically effective. This pragmatic flexibility anticipated modern understanding of placebo effects, therapeutic relationships, and the importance of cultural competence in medical practice. Ancient physicians discovered through centuries of clinical experience what modern research has confirmed. Healing involves complex interactions between biological, psychological, social, and cultural factors. The architectural integration of sacred and scientific spaces within the Asclepians provides physical evidence of this sophisticated approach to mental health treatment. The same complex might house a library containing rational medical texts, a surgical suite equipped with bronze instruments, a sacred spring for ritual purification, and an abaton for dream healing. Patients could move between these different therapeutic modalities as their condition and preferences dictated. Progress to dream therapy to explore psychological conflicts, participate in dramatic performances to achieve cathartic emotional release, and conclude with ritual ceremonies that reintegrated them into normal social life. The priest-physicians who supervised these complex treatment protocols developed case management skills that wouldn't be systematically studied by Western medicine until the 20th century, coordinated multiple interventions, and adjusted treatment plans based on ongoing assessment of therapeutic response. Some of the most remarkable innovations in ancient psychiatric practice emerged from the creative tension between sacred and scientific approaches. The use of therapeutic drama, for example, combined rational understanding of emotional catharsis with religious traditions of ritual purification and community participation. Patients at the Asclepians didn't merely watch dramatic performances, they participated in them. Acting out mythological stories allowed individuals to explore their own psychological conflicts through symbolic representation. The shared communal experience of drama provided social support and reduced the isolation that often accompanied mental illness. Modern psychotherapy has rediscovered many of these techniques in approaches like psychodrama, narrative therapy, and expressive arts therapy. The ancient insight that healing can occur through symbolic expression and community participation remains central to contemporary mental health practice. The integration of music therapy within ancient healing traditions demonstrates similar sophistication. Greek physicians didn't simply play soothing music for agitated patients. They developed specific musical prescriptions based on detailed understanding of how different scales, rhythms, and instruments affected emotional states. The Dorian mode was prescribed for manic episodes because its stable, measured progressions could help restore emotional equilibrium. The Phrygian mode was used for depression because its complex harmonies and ascending melodic lines could lift mood and increase energy. Modern music therapy has confirmed that different musical elements can indeed influence brain activity and emotional response in predictable ways. Color therapy, environmental design, and what we would now call horticultural therapy were also integrated into ancient healing environments. The gardens surrounding the Asclepians were carefully designed to provide sensory experiences that promoted psychological healing. Specific plants were chosen not only for their pharmaceutical properties, but also for their colors, fragrances, and symbolic associations. The sacred groves within these healing complexes served multiple therapeutic functions. They provided quiet spaces for meditation and reflection, natural settings for therapeutic walks, and symbolic representations of renewal and growth that reinforced patients' hope for recovery. Ancient physicians also recognized the importance of nutrition in mental health treatment. They developed detailed dietary prescriptions that addressed both physical and psychological aspects of illness. Foods were classified not only by their nutritional content, but also by their effects on mood and behavior. Warm, moist foods were prescribed for melancholic patients to counter the cold, dry humors that were believed to cause depression. Cool, dry foods were given to manic individuals to reduce the hot, wet imbalances that produced excessive excitement. While the theoretical framework was incorrect, many of these dietary recommendations had genuine therapeutic value. The emphasis on fresh vegetables, lean proteins, and moderate alcohol consumption anticipated modern understanding of the relationship between nutrition and mental health. Ancient physicians also recognized that eating disorders could both cause and result from psychological disturbance, leading to integrated treatment approaches that addressed both nutritional and emotional needs. Within the complex tapestry of ancient Greek psychiatric practice lay a darker thread that reveals the intersection of gender, medicine, and social control. The treatment of mental illness in women was profoundly shaped by cultural beliefs about feminine nature that would influence medical practice for centuries to come. Ancient Greek physicians, despite their sophisticated understanding of many aspects of mental health, held deeply problematic views about women's psychology and physiology. These beliefs led to diagnostic categories and treatments that were both scientifically flawed and ethically troubling. Yet they also, paradoxically, resulted in some remarkably advanced insights into conditions that primarily affected women. The most infamous of these gender-specific diagnoses was hysteria, derived from the Greek word hysteron, meaning womb. According to ancient medical theory, women possessed an organ that men lacked, and this difference made them vulnerable to unique forms of mental illness that were essentially unknown in the male population. The concept of the wandering womb represented one of the most bizarre theories in ancient medicine. Physicians believed that the uterus could become dislodged from its normal position and travel throughout the body, causing various physical and psychological symptoms wherever it settled. When the wandering womb reached the chest, it caused difficulty breathing and heart palpitations. When it moved to the head, it produced hallucinations, emotional outbursts, and irrational behavior. This theory wasn't entirely irrational within the context of ancient anatomical knowledge. Greek physicians had limited understanding of internal anatomy, particularly female reproductive systems. They observed that women experienced various symptoms that seemed to correlate with menstrual cycles, pregnancy, and menopause. The wandering womb theory represented their attempt to explain these observations within their existing theoretical framework. The treatments prescribed for wandering womb conditions were often elaborate and sometimes effective, though not for the reasons ancient physicians believed. Women suffering from what was diagnosed as uterine displacement were subjected to fumigation. Treatments involving aromatic herbs burned near the pelvis to attract the womb back to its proper position. Simultaneously, noxious odors were applied near the nose and mouth to repel the organ from the upper body. Modern analysis suggests that these fumigation treatments might have provided genuine therapeutic benefits through aromatherapy effects and the attention and care that patients received during the elaborate procedures. The social ritual of healing, combined with the expectation of improvement, could indeed produce psychological benefits, regardless of the theoretical framework. More problematic were the sexual treatments prescribed for hysteria. Ancient physicians believed that sexual frustration could cause the womb to wander in search of satisfaction. This led to medical recommendations that included marriage, pregnancy, and various forms of genital stimulation as therapeutic interventions. While these treatments were based on incorrect anatomical theories, they inadvertently addressed some genuine aspects of women's psychological and physical health. The social isolation and sexual repression that characterized many women's lives in ancient society could indeed contribute to depression, anxiety, and various physical symptoms. Medical interventions that increased social interaction and physical intimacy might have provided real benefits. The most sophisticated ancient physicians recognized that many cases of hysteria involved psychological rather than purely physical causes. They observed that women from higher social classes who had more leisure time and fewer outlets for their intellectual and creative energies seemed more prone to hysterical symptoms than working-class women who remained physically and mentally active. This observation led to treatment recommendations that anticipated modern understanding of the relationship between meaningful activity and mental health. Wealthy women suffering from hysteria were prescribed physical exercise, intellectual pursuits, and social engagement as alternatives to purely medical interventions. Some ancient physicians also recognized that domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of trauma could produce symptoms that were being incorrectly diagnosed as wandering womb conditions. These insights led to more sophisticated approaches to taking patient histories and understanding the social contexts that contributed to women's mental health problems. The case studies preserved in ancient medical texts reveal both the limitations and the occasional insights of ancient approaches to women's mental health. One particularly detailed account describes a young woman whose hysterical symptoms began shortly after an arranged marriage to an older man whom she found repulsive. The physician initially prescribed standard treatments for uterine displacement, but when these proved ineffective, he began exploring the patient's emotional state and social circumstances. Through careful questioning, the physician discovered that the woman's symptoms intensified whenever her husband approached her sexually and diminished when she was able to spend time with friends and pursue intellectual interests. This led to a treatment plan that involved negotiating with the husband for more autonomy and developing coping strategies for managing an unwanted marriage. While the physician's theoretical framework remained flawed, his practical approach demonstrated remarkable psychological insight. He recognized that women's mental health could be profoundly affected by social relationships and life circumstances, and he attempted to address these underlying causes rather than simply treating symptoms. Ancient Greek literature also preserves accounts of women's mental illness that reveal the social stigma and isolation that often accompanied psychological problems. Euripides' play Medea presents a complex portrait of a woman whose legitimate grievances against an unfaithful husband escalate into psychotic rage that ultimately leads to the murder of her own children. The character of Medea demonstrates ancient understanding of how powerlessness, betrayal, and social rejection could contribute to severe mental illness. Her psychological deterioration follows a recognizable pattern: initial depression and withdrawal, followed by increasingly grandiose and paranoid thinking, and finally by violent acting out that destroys both her enemies and herself. Modern feminist scholars have argued that Medea's madness represents a response to the impossible position of women in ancient society, who had few legal rights and limited options for addressing injustices committed against them. The play suggests that the social conditions that oppressed women could themselves drive individuals to psychiatric extremes. Other ancient sources describe women's mental health problems that appear to be responses to reproductive trauma, miscarriage, infant mortality, and complications from childbirth were common experiences that could trigger severe depression and anxiety. Ancient physicians developed treatments for these conditions that combined pharmaceutical interventions with psychological support and ritual healing. The integration of midwifery and psychiatric care in ancient medicine represents one of the more advanced aspects of women's health treatment. Experienced midwives served not only as birth attendants, but also as counselors who could recognize and address the emotional complications of reproductive experiences. These practitioner healers developed sophisticated understanding of postpartum depression, grief reactions to infant loss, and the psychological challenges of menopause. Their treatments combined herbal remedies with emotional support and practical assistance that anticipated modern approaches to women's reproductive mental health. The ancient Greek world was shaped by almost constant warfare, from small-scale raids between city-states to massive conflicts like the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. This pervasive military culture created unique challenges for understanding and treating what we would now recognize as combat-related mental health disorders. Greek society idealized the warrior as the ultimate expression of masculine virtue. Courage in battle was considered the highest form of human excellence, and military success determined both individual honor and community survival. Yet this same culture that glorified warfare also had to grapple with the psychological consequences of violence and trauma. The earliest descriptions of combat-related psychological problems appear in Homer's epic poems, composed in the 8th century BCE, but describing events from the Bronze Age collapse centuries earlier. These texts contain remarkably accurate portrayals of what modern psychiatry would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor guilt, and moral injury. Achilles' rage, the central theme of the Iliad, can be understood as a psychological response to the trauma of prolonged combat and the loss of his beloved companion, Patroclus. His symptoms include hypervigilance, explosive anger, social withdrawal, and an obsessive focus on revenge that overrides normal social bonds and rational decision-making. The description of Achilles' grief and fury contains details that match modern clinical observations of combat trauma. He experiences sleep disturbances, loss of appetite, emotional numbing, alternating with overwhelming rage, and a profound sense of meaninglessness that leads him to withdraw from normal social activities. When Achilles finally returns to battle, his behavior becomes increasingly erratic and violent. He desecrates enemy corpses, refuses to show mercy to surrendering opponents, and demonstrates a level of brutality that horrifies even his fellow warriors. This escalation of violence represents a pattern that modern military psychiatry recognizes as a common response to severe combat stress. The Odyssey presents a different but equally compelling portrait of combat trauma in its description of Odysseus' 10-year struggle to return home after the Trojan War. His wanderings can be interpreted as a metaphor for the difficulty that traumatized veterans experience in readjusting to civilian life and reconnecting with families and communities they left behind. Odysseus' encounters with monsters and supernatural threats represent the intrusive memories and hypervigilance that characterize post-traumatic stress. His inability to follow direct routes home suggests the avoidance behaviors that trauma survivors often develop. His gradual recovery occurs only through confronting his past experiences and reconnecting with his core identity and relationships. Ancient Greek military culture developed several institutional responses to combat trauma that anticipated modern approaches to military mental health. The concept of philotimo, or honor among brothers in arms, created strong social bonds that provided psychological support during and after combat. Warriors were expected to protect not only themselves, but also their companions, creating mutual aid networks that could help individuals cope with traumatic experiences. The ritual purification ceremonies that soldiers underwent after battle served multiple psychological functions. These rites provided structured opportunities to process traumatic experiences, reintegrate into civilian society, and receive community acknowledgement of their service and sacrifice. The symbolic cleansing of blood and violence helped warriors transition between their military and civilian identities. Greek religious practices also provided frameworks for understanding and addressing combat trauma. The concept of miasma, or spiritual pollution caused by violence, acknowledged that participation in warfare could have lasting psychological consequences that required active intervention to resolve. Veterans who showed signs of persistent psychological problems after returning from war were sometimes sent to Asclepions for treatment. The therapeutic approaches used in these healing centers proved remarkably effective for addressing combat-related mental health issues. The combination of physical healing, dream therapy, community support, and ritual purification provided comprehensive care that addressed both individual symptoms and social reintegration. Ancient physicians recognized that different types of combat experience could produce different psychological outcomes. Soldiers who had killed in face-to-face combat often showed different symptoms than those who had witnessed mass casualties or experienced siege warfare. Survivors of naval battles, with their unique combination of combat stress and survival trauma, required specialized treatment approaches. The Greek understanding of combat psychology also acknowledged the role of moral injury in military mental health problems. Warriors who had been forced to commit acts that violated their personal ethical codes, or who had witnessed atrocities committed by their own forces, often developed persistent psychological symptoms that were distinct from those caused by fear or physical trauma. Treatment approaches for moral injury involved confession and absolution rituals that allowed veterans to acknowledge their actions and receive community forgiveness. These practices recognized that psychological healing required addressing ethical and spiritual dimensions of trauma, not just emotional and behavioral symptoms. Ancient military medicine also developed sophisticated approaches to preventing and treating what we would now call military sexual trauma. The close quarters and power dynamics of military life created opportunities for sexual violence that could have lasting psychological consequences for victims. Greek military law included provisions for prosecuting sexual assault, and military physicians developed treatment protocols for addressing the psychological aftermath of these crimes. The integration of athletic training and military preparation in Greek culture provided another avenue for addressing combat-related mental health issues. Physical exercise, competitive sports, and martial arts training were understood to build not only physical strength, but also psychological resilience that could help warriors cope with the stresses of combat. The gymnasium served as a social institution where young men learned not only military skills, but also the psychological disciplines necessary for effective warfare. This training included techniques for managing fear, maintaining group cohesion under stress, and developing the emotional control necessary for tactical decision-making in chaotic combat situations. Ancient Greek philosophy also contributed to military mental health through the development of ethical frameworks that could help warriors understand their role in society and maintain psychological equilibrium despite participation in violence. Stoic philosophy, in particular, provided practical techniques for emotional regulation and stress management that were specifically adapted for military applications. The concept of virtue ethics, with its emphasis on courage, justice, and wisdom, provided warriors with moral frameworks that could help them navigate the ethical complexities of warfare while maintaining their psychological integrity. These philosophical systems served as early forms of moral education that could prevent or mitigate moral injury. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinthine world of ancient Greek psychiatry, we find ourselves confronting a profound truth. The human mind, in all its complexity and fragility, has remained fundamentally unchanged across the millennia. The fears, hopes, and struggles that drove our ancestors to drill holes in skulls and build elaborate healing temples continue to shape our relationship with mental illness today. The innovations developed by ancient Greek physicians laid foundations that extend far beyond historical curiosity. When modern therapists use dream analysis to help patients understand unconscious conflicts, they're employing techniques first developed in the Asclepians 25 centuries ago, when contemporary psychiatrists recognized the importance of treating the whole person rather than just symptoms. They're rediscovering wisdom that Hippocratic physicians understood intuitively. The integration of pharmaceutical intervention, psychological counseling, social support, and spiritual care that characterized the best ancient psychiatric practice anticipates the holistic approaches that modern medicine is still struggling to implement effectively. Ancient practitioners understood that healing required addressing biological, psychological, social, and existential dimensions of human experience simultaneously. Perhaps most importantly, the ancient Greek approach to mental illness demonstrated remarkable respect for the dignity and humanity of people experiencing psychological distress. While their theoretical frameworks were often incorrect, their commitment to healing rather than simply controlling or punishing mentally ill individuals established ethical principles that remain relevant today. The courage of ancient physicians to document their cases, experiment with new treatments, and question existing assumptions laid the groundwork for scientific psychiatry. Their willingness to combine empirical observation with theoretical innovation created methodologies that continue to drive medical progress. Yet our exploration has also revealed the dangers that arise when medical knowledge becomes separated from ethical reflection and social responsibility. The experimental procedures performed on vulnerable patients, the gender biases that shaped diagnostic categories, and the social inequalities that determined access to care remind us that medical progress must always be balanced against human rights and social justice. The ancient Greeks understood something that modern society sometimes forgets. Mental illness affects not just individuals, but entire communities. Their emphasis on social reintegration, community support, and shared responsibility for healing recognized that psychological health depends on social relationships and cultural contexts as much as individual biology. The stigma and discrimination that ancient societies attached to mental illness continues to shape contemporary attitudes and policies. The courage required to seek treatment, the isolation experienced by patients and families, and the struggle to maintain dignity in the face of psychological distress remain remarkably similar across the centuries. But there is also hope in this continuity. The creativity and resilience that ancient physicians demonstrated in developing new approaches to mental health treatment continues to inspire contemporary innovation. The integration of traditional healing practices with modern scientific knowledge offers possibilities for more effective and humane psychiatric care. As we face contemporary challenges in mental health care, from rising suicide rates to inadequate access to treatment, the ancient Greek example reminds us that healing requires both scientific rigor and human compassion. It demands innovation balanced with respect for human dignity, and progress measured not just in technical advancement, but in the reduction of human suffering. The holes drilled in ancient skulls and the dreams interpreted in sacred temples represent humanity's enduring commitment to healing the invisible wounds of the mind. They remind us that the struggle to understand and treat mental illness is not a modern problem requiring modern solutions, but an ancient human responsibility that connects us across time and culture. The whispers of the past still echo in the corridors of contemporary psychiatric hospitals, in the offices of modern therapists, and in the experiences of individuals and families grappling with mental illness today. These echoes carry both warnings about the dangers of arrogance and ignorance in medical practice and promises about the healing that becomes possible when knowledge is combined with wisdom, innovation with compassion, and scientific understanding with respect for the mystery and dignity of human consciousness. In the end, the ancient Greeks' greatest contribution to mental health care may not have been any specific technique or theory, but rather their demonstration that healing the mind requires the full engagement of human creativity, empathy, and determination. They showed us that the battle against mental illness is not a technical problem to be solved, but a human responsibility to be embraced, generation after generation, with all the courage and wisdom we can muster. The story continues, and we are all part of it. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of ancient wisdom and human resilience. If this journey through time has moved or intrigued you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What connections do you see between these ancient practices and modern mental health care? What lessons from the past might help us address contemporary challenges? Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of human history, where the past illuminates the present and ancient wisdom guides us toward a more compassionate future.